Hello, hello. Thank you. Okay. Okay, setting up my timer so I don't cross. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm very glad that you're able to join. Today, I'm going to be talking about the topic that I'm particularly passionate about. That is the development of threats, particularly in the area of OT, industrial control systems. I will discuss a bit more to get everyone in the room in the same channel so that we know what we're going to be discussing. But there's a chance if you're around here, you already are familiar with some of this concept and terminology. Before going into that, though, I just want to do a brief introduction, just about where I'm coming from, what I'm representing. For those familiar, I'm working with Mandiant. Mandiant got acquired by Google last year, and our team has been doing threat intelligence since many, many years. You might already be familiar. And particularly, I come to bring you some of the knowledge from the cyber-physical team. The team looking into everything that has an overlap between the cyber component, basically, the computers, whatnot, and the engineering component, anything that can impact our physical world. So to begin, I just created an image, I was thinking about the title for this topic and tried to come up with how it would look like, how it would be envisioned. And I came up with the concept of Renaissance. Renaissance, most people will know it because of old times, old paintings, creations, and whatnot. Just clarification, this is AI generated, of course. It's a fake old painting. Trying to represent this idea of industrial plus Renaissance of capabilities of cyber-physical, which is what I'm going to be talking about right now. It is how we have seen this evolution on the field of cyber-physical threats, moving from a field where there was barely nothing, and we used to go and try to find what was relevant, into a field where right now we are finding every year we're basically observing more and more events, more malware, more capabilities, and definitely more interest to develop this type of malware and this type of attacks. And so, to get everyone on the same channel, before getting already into the weeds, the other thing that I wanted to see is how many of you, please raise your hands if you are working, if you are familiar with operational technology, control systems, and you work with that. Is there anyone in the room that is specialized in this field? Okay, I don't see any, which is better, because that means then it's going to be even more interesting. So basically, yeah, in this area, what we'll look into is the overlap between the computing side and the controllers. The controllers, I'm talking about all the engineering equipment that you use in a factory, basically, in a industrial facility, for nuclear, for water, for whatnot, and basically that you use this equipment so that you can keep a process running and you can go and generate your product. The reason why this is such a big field recently is because the level that you see of security at the computing level versus the engineering equipment is very different. There is very little security in this area. That is, I mean, once you get into that network, so normally they tend to be isolated, separated, and you tend to look at very specific types of equipment. And what we are going to be looking today is a big summary of how this evolution happened in this field, and particularly the most recent type of malware that we have observed for generating this type of offensive capability. I'm talking about, when I say offensive, I am talking this time for real things that can have an impact in the physical world. That you can go and impact the production of something, that you can go and impact the physical, the engineering process. That being said, when I mentioned that this is a new field, a relatively new field, I am not exaggerating. This is basically everything we've seen in the field at a high level. So the first thing that most of you are probably already familiar with was 2010. We see very old, this is Stuxnet attack against nuclear centrifuges in Iran. And basically, through this attack, the program was delayed for a very long time. This was the first time we see this type of physical attack taking place for real in the physical world. And of course, it was interesting, but it was something isolated, extremely complex, and only developed for one single type of device, well, for a very specific type of devices, and they required a ton of investment. Through the next years, we saw a couple additional cases, particularly related to most likely sort of testing these type of capabilities in case of Russia versus Ukraine. At the time, we saw a couple power outages caused by these type of effects in 2015, 2016. 2017, we see a very big case that actually Mandiet, my organization, responded to, that is called Triton, where we see an attacker in the Middle East impacting the safety instrumented systems, basically the last layer of defense before being able to blow up something in this type of facility. And then after that, we were wondering, every time we see something more complex, what is coming next? How is it going to look in the next year? And instead what we saw is the opposite. Things started getting more simple. We started seeing ransomware impacting as well the engineering systems every now and then indirectly. We started seeing different actors that knew something, basically what we call low sophistication, that can be an individual, activist, small groups, starting to try to target these type of systems, mainly when they were exposed. And over time, it became more and more prevalent. And when it became interesting, like the reason why we are now at this point where we can have this discussion is because during the last 2 years, we saw an explosion. Everything started changing. And it was, of course, in parallel to the conflict in Ukraine. And now what we're seeing also in Israel, basically Israel, Palestine, we started seeing more of these cases and even more interest. And particularly, last year, unfortunately, I do not have time to talk about it right now, but if you're curious for 2022, you can take a look at our blogs on In-Destroyer version 2, on In-Controller. Right now, I'm going to focus on the things that we saw this year, and particularly cosmic energy, which was the most interesting, the type of capability that helped us starting to come up with this conclusion and understanding where this trend is going. So this is just at a very high level, but we are here to know more about the weeds and what actually this malware looks like. So let's discuss cosmic energy, and from there we can have some thoughts into this type of unique type of malware and capability. So cosmic energy, what is it? First of all, how do we find it? Cosmic energy is a very specific type of malware, so that you know, malware for industrial control systems for OT has only been discovered 2 times up until today without an attack, just by hunting. And basically 2 times it was some of our analysts. In this occasion, basically, it was one of our analysts that was looking for malware based on prior cases of OT malware against electricity, basically against power grid. And this analyst, basically what he found was in a known, let's say, malware analysis sandbox, he was able to retrieve this specific sample that was catching our attention, was submitted from Russia during the time of the conflict, most likely as a test, seemed to be interesting and useful, but we were very, very curious about what it actually entailed. It didn't seem as complicated as other samples, but at the same time, it did seem to have the capability to have this type of physical impact. So we got very curious and started looking into it. And then, well, I mean, after doing the analysis and whatever, the first thing we came up with was a description. What is cosmic energy? Basically, the big summary is malware for operational technology, particularly for electric power disruption. What makes it special, or a couple of things that make it special, one of them is that it interacts with a protocol that's called IEC 104. IEC 104 is a protocol that is specific for basically energy, for the energy sector. We have seen it targeted in the past with in the 2016 attack. In 2022, another one with 2 of these prior malware strains related to geopolitical tensions, Russia/Ukraine. And what it does basically is that this protocol is used to interact with something that's called RTU, Remote Terminal Unit. An RTU is a type of equipment from OT, from control systems, that you use to interact with the devices in the field, like at the electricity level, so that you have the RTU interacts with your controllers, and then those give the let's say, the instructions of what you're going to be doing with your switchers, breakers, whatever equipment. The other thing that's very interesting and important to mention here is that it was possibly developed by a contractor as a red teaming tool. I am going to discuss a bit more of that, how we come up with that conclusion and what are the implications, because on the one hand, it is good, on the other hand, it is not. But yeah, that one, just believe me for now. It is most likely a red teaming tool, and the capability is similar to other OT malware. As I mentioned, we're talking about, there's only been like 6, 7, maybe 8 strains of OT malware up until today, in the past 13 years. So cosmic energy, how does it look like? What you see here is a diagram of where we try to explain how cosmic energy works. It is basically divided in 2 modules. The first module that it has, PyHop, what it does is more common, more simple to other malware that we've seen. Basically, it is to be used in MS SQL Server. And basically, the idea is just that it compromises the host, and then it deploys the second module, Lightwork. Lightwork, the second module, is the one that has the OT capability. What we mean by the OT capability is it is the one that communicates with IEC 104. And given what I mentioned of the difference in security between OT and IT, of course, well, there is not such big amount of security in IEC 104. In fact, it is very easy to communicate with the device as long as you provide the right inputs, which is what Lightwork does. So the first piece of the malware just drops Lightwork, then Lightwork goes and runs itself, then the malware deletes itself, and then nothing happened except your switches and breakers turn on and off and just change to what the attacker wants. The other thing in here is with Lightwork, basically. Well, I'm just going to skip that because it was just like a highlight, but just so that you understand, yeah, probably I shouldn't, but basically, so that you understand the point in here, what it does is turning off on and off the power. This is also something very interesting because sometimes if you see historically the attacks where someone has turned off power, normally the question is, why would anyone want to do that if it's only a couple minutes or a couple hours or whatever? But right now that we're having the conflict and that we can see more cases where this type of capability is used next to, for example, what's happening in Ukraine, then you see that there might be other psychological impacts, other types of collateral impacts that can be paired up with different types of events. So just, yeah, so you understand the relevance of this malware is that it allows you to do this type of attack where you can basically turn off the power. And so, back to the other point, Lightwork. The interesting thing in Lightwork is that when we start looking at that piece of malware, this is basically like when we run it, some of the example of the hard-coded values that it had. Basically, it allows the attacker to set up the values that it wants to communicate to this industrial equipment. What you see here, for example, on the left, the IOAs, they are basically information objects that what they are being used to is to tell the RTU what to do. But what is very interesting is that this type of command is something that it depends on the device. It can be set up by engineers. It is set up by the engineer on a case basis, so it's not something standard. It's not like they found an index or something, but rather that they need to have some discovery capabilities and know something about the victim, so that they can set up this value. Then, of course, IP addresses, the port sources, the protocols that they're going to use and whatnot. So it requires some reconnaissance. It is not a tool that you just run and it's going to do something terrible. It is a tool that you need to know where it's going to be deployed and how it's going to be deployed. And this, as I'm going to discuss in a couple of minutes, has to do a ton with the type of development we're seeing, where this type of attack becomes something that is not to be automated, but rather to be placed in a toolkit. So you have the different capabilities, and all together, you can decide how to use them in parallel to other events or whatever you want to do in the physical world. A quick note, this sample was not perfect. It wasn't running by itself already. It had some very weird mistakes. So for example, in some cases, the sample would run, and then it would erase itself before it ran. In other cases, it would basically not not be ready to run some of the commands, so basically run commands before being compiled. So we did some minor tweaks, and now it was working. It makes a lot of sense since we found it in malware analysis sandbox, so it makes sense that it was under testing, under development. Nothing that could not be fixed with a couple lines of code. Now that being said, I mentioned 2 minutes ago that it was probably a red teaming tool. Let's see why I'm saying that. And this is probably my favorite part of the research, that after we found this malware, we were thinking, I mean, you know, like we were about to publish and say, look, we found the next OT event, and look, you know, like this is what's going to happen. It's terrible. Let's be very worried about where it's going to be deployed. But then when looking at some of the strings in the code, we run into this thing that says the solar polygon. I'm pretty sure that no one here has seen a solar polygon, because this is just a random image. It does not mean anything. After looking into the concept of a solar polygon, we realized it was something very specific. There's like one research paper that has come up with that. It sounded like it was going to be a project or something. And then initially we started looking and there was nothing. So when we were about to publish, I just came up with the idea, what if we just look in Cyrillic? Maybe we'll find something else. And we actually did. We ran into something very specific. What it seems to mean, I mean, based on our analysis, is that there is a large telecommunications company in Russia called Rostelecom. Rostelecom recently acquired a company called Solar that basically does cybersecurity. And then altogether they were they received a subsidy from the Russian Ministry of Defense to go and do some different types of security training and whatnot in what's called a polygon. I didn't know, but a place where the policemen, for example, go and shoot, like to test, it's called a polygon. So that is why Rostelecom Solar Polygon, period. After that, we started looking into it, and you can see this is some of the news that we identified. It is public, like a couple times at least, that the polygon has been used during events and whatnot. So most likely, this was a tool to be tested in there. And in some cases, this polygon has been used to test attacks, let's say, on energy grid, at a small level, of course. Now, also, I mean, if you want, here I don't want to tell you it is or it's not. I want to give you all the evidence, and then you can also make your own assessment. So just to put this in context so that you understand what else tells us that maybe we're on the right track, is by evaluating the past activity that we have seen particularly from Russian actors in OT. And you see there that I'm pointing out to two specific points in time. In Destroyer 2016, in Destroyer 2, 2022. If you're interested in these attacks against power grid, take a look at those two. They're like iconic cases that we have seen in the past. And basically, they were very similar. There were a lot of similarities with this malware, which is what we mentioned here. Basically, it seems like whomever developed Cosmic Energy either took ideas from this malware or had done it in the past, or just, you know, it makes a lot of sense. Actually, it's not so easy to find the first samples of the first in Destroyer. The second one, there are a couple available, but the first one is a bit trickier. But basically, what they have in common, the three pieces of malware, is first of all, of course, the energy transmission and distribution. Basically, that's the main objective of this malware. The second thing is similar strategy, using IEC 104 to turn on and off, basically to send the commands to the RTU. The next one is the use of MS SQL Server. This one, from an IT perspective, is not going to sound that impressive because, you know, it's the same as whichever, right? Like, okay, SQL Server. But from an OT perspective, given that you normally try to separate this control system infrastructure from the rest of the IT, it brings very good insights. Because whenever that happens, this type of connection to MS SQL Server, it shows you one of the few ways in which the actor can go and reach out to your control system. This is also very interesting and controversial. We recently had some researcher from other organization and actually some people like working on the field that told us, hey, you know, many devices have this integration with MS SQL Server. We probably should be looking more into that. So if you're curious, also definitely another topic of research that might be interesting. And lastly, they had both references to something that's called OIK. OIK is a specific type of software that is used for telemetry at energy facilities in Ukraine. It's not something known, it's just something that we saw in the references in strings in the 3 malware. And based on that, we went back and figured out what it was. But again, fairly specific. Either it's chosen because they know the targets are using it, or it's chosen because whomever is developing is familiar with this type of malware. So now, the big question is, some people reached out and said then it's not a big deal because it's red teaming malware, right? But some people, including ourselves, we thought it was actually sort of a fairly big deal. And this is why we think it is actually so relevant. I'm going to bring here like all the different facts so that we can reach our conclusions. The first thing is there is a remote chance that the tool could be used in the wild eventually. The reason why we believe this could happen is because it actually functions, so why not? We have seen such simple tools like in Destroyer 2 that is very similar, used in the wild, so yes, it could be deployed. Although the chance might be low, based on our beliefs. The second thing is red teaming tools, of course. Many of you might have seen actors using red teaming tools in the real world. It is a possibility, it has happened, it wouldn't be the first time. Next one is the barriers of entry, lowering, which refers basically to the fact that now you don't have to develop malware that is so complex, such as Stuxnet in the past or Triton, but just this type of lightweight tool, and then deploy it alongside other malware to develop an impact. And then the last one, which is actually the most interesting, is the fact that we have seen in the past nation states using these type of contractors to develop offensive capabilities. And in fact, the image you see here on the right is from one of those cases. That is a real case that we published in 2022. That's called the Vulcan Leaks. If you're curious, you can find it. We have a blog about that. And basically what you are seeing here is a list of requirements from Russian Ministry of Defense, where they were asking for different type of capabilities, of offensive capabilities on 3 areas. One of them was, let's say, like general cybersecurity, collecting all the data. Well, sorry, there are 3 modules that you see here. Each module corresponds to different capabilities, but they were basically working on collecting a ton of data for vulnerabilities, for exposed servers, for IP addresses, for websites, for everything, putting it together, and then developing capabilities to deploy different modules, some of them for OT, for control systems. That is the reason why I'm showing this. Some of them for information operations, so more like social media, disinformation, channeling, those type of campaigns. And basically what it was trying is to develop these different tools or modules and put them together so that whomever it is, different teams or whatever, could use it as part of broader attacks. This was actually very interesting, particularly from an OT perspective, because we were able to see, even though we were not able to see the tools, we were able to see what were the capabilities that they were trying to develop. It was a requirement, it was like the legal documentation that said, this is what you want, what we want you to do. And they were asking literally for those 2 things you see in here, basically like manipulating speed of trains, causing impacts, causing it to fail, closing valves, shutting down pumps. Basically, all of these were things that I'm not coming up with, but rather that were stated as requirements from the contractor, NTC Vulcan was the name, in this specific set of requirements. So when you connect both things, you're seeing, now putting a bit of all together, is you have all this type of like nation-state support. On the one hand, developing the contracts to try to develop these capabilities. You're seeing the development of this type of malware, red teaming, and for attacks, because we've seen the past cases. And when you start putting it together, you see a bit of where this is heading. This is another example of capabilities that are being developed right now. Why we are seeing right now all of this rising attention on the OT side. Normally, in OT control systems, we say that vulnerabilities are not that relevant, because why would you need a vulnerability if your device is already vulnerable by itself? It doesn't have the level of security of other devices. But there were 2 vulnerabilities this year that were actually very interesting, And the reason why they were interesting is because at the same time that they were published, the people doing the investigation, including US government, including the vendor of the product, these vulnerabilities are in Rockwell automation products. They basically were able to share some more information on how this was related to an APT. And possibly developed in the same way as in controller, another big attack that we saw the year before, where there was this type of development of a vulnerability, of an exploit, and then the moving from that into modules of malware that you can use to target different types of industrial devices. So all of this, as you can tell, seems to be small pieces in a puzzle, where instead of developing one single big attack that you can only use once, you develop a ton of different pieces. And then once you want to target a specific victim, like a factory, like energy, water, whatever, you choose from the toolset that you have, and you are able to go based on the devices, on the type of equipment they have. This paired up with the type of espionage that we normally observe in our intelligence group. Of course, it's very concerning because once you know what's in there and once you have the tools to interact with that and the knowledge, that is when it starts becoming more dangerous and more agile than in the past. Of course, I needed a cat picture. It has to be in every presentation. And in this case, basically what I wanted to do was this analogy of whether it's dangerous or not, this type of red teaming tool. And how we're measuring this conclusion is, on the one hand, you have the tool, basically. You have the malware, you have the capability, which is an analogy to the feet or the paws of a cat, right? It has a tool. It is something that it's very cute, it's fluffy, it's nice, it's beautiful. But then if the cat intends to hurt you, it can really hurt you. It's gonna scratch you terribly. So it's the same basically. They have a tool that can be very cute, cosmic energy, very simple, but then if it's intended to be used against you, it can actually scratch you. So in this case, we're talking about offensive capability in the sense of like, we do know what's under development, and simple or not, it has the capability to go and generate this physical impact, and it matches with all the intentionality we have seen in the past based on the growing development of these capabilities from these same type of actors. So that being said, I don't like to just leave these type of talks in like, you know, is it or not dangerous? It's terrible. This is where it's going. But actually, I also want to give something practical, something back in the sense of what can you do? How can you find this? How does it look like? You know, if we only have found 2 or 3 cases of this OT malware in the hunting platforms, why is it like? How can you also do the same, right? And then there are 3 main learnings from that were shared from our threat hunters that they have observed in this type of OT malware historically. The first one is abuse of the insecure protocols, like the ones on IEC 104, Modbus, basically all of this set of industrial protocols. If you're familiar with them, you probably have seen that they don't really have any integrated security. If you're not familiar and you're curious in the topic, I invite you to take a look. The second one is Python for malware development and packaging. Anyone here, most likely, will think Python. I mean, that's absurd. I mean, if I hunt for Python, I'm going to find everything. But actually, that is not necessarily true. When you look at the factory level, at the industrial level, most often you do not have Python running at the process control domain. And if you do have it, you know it's running. So most normally, if you look for this type of compilation and you see something running, there is a probability you might run into anything new or different. Normally, there are big processes that the engineers had to follow so that they can run something like this in a very secure type of environment, like the OT level. And then lastly, we have the open source libraries to implement protocols. This refers basically to because of the uniqueness of these protocols, it is not as simple to work with them as with other type of general knowledge on the computing level. So basically, we have seen that in these types of malware, oftentimes they use open source libraries that are available, which is another thing you can hunt for. If someone is using any of these type of libraries and it's without your knowledge at the engineering level, then probably that is something that might be relevant for you. Based on this though, I just really want to highlight the Python level. You don't have to understand this. I personally don't even understand it, but my hunter really wanted it here. And since he discovered it, I kept it. Basically, what he wanted to highlight is really this idea of looking for the Python type of development, because once again, most of this OT malware has used Python for deployment, and in the environments where it was deployed, oftentimes it was not even allowed. So it is very interesting to see that such a simple thing could have helped to identify this type of attack, and can help us to identify future attacks because of the feasibility for deployment. General discovery methods, I'm not going to get too much into this. Normally, this is more like a gift in case you're going to find it useful, of course. I know that the slides are also going to go public. You can take a look, or whatnot. But basically, yeah, there are the two learnings, once again, on the Python level. The second one is going to be on the MS SQL level. Basically, any type of equipment that you're going to use to interact with the OT and that it can have this type of external exposure is something that you can take a look into, and that might help you prevent this type of attack, at least in two situations, like as we have seen with Destroyer in the past and with Cosmic Energy. The other reason why this is very, very interesting is because in the past we used to think that once we expose a piece of malware, it is not going to be effective anymore, at least for the industrial cases. It was like, we expose it, so we don't even look for it. But the interesting thing is that actually we've seen the reuse of some of this type of malware, or at least of some modules in there. And then, for example, the second strain of Destroyer, this is the name of one of them. The second strain, we found it by looking for the initial Destroyer and being deployed in a real world scenario. So that being said, I just want to share some main takeaways. I think I've been mentioning around, but I like to put them all together so that if there's a couple of things you want to take from today. The first one is that the barriers of entry are lowering for OT types of attacks and the capabilities. As you can see, it used to be very complicated, and every time it's getting more simple, is becoming more feasible. And I don't mean for everyone. It doesn't mean that you're going to do it in your house. I mean, you could try, yeah, but it means more like at the sophisticated actor level. It is becoming something more attainable that does not require a large team of engineering and a large team of computing scientists working all together in the lab for 5 years, but rather that you can do this type of a smaller type of simple development. And then you can use it to complement other type of attacks. The second thing is Cosmic Energy, particularly this last strain of malware we saw. It is similar to older ones, which tells us that new families to come can still share those type of similarities. So still looking at the high level from what we have learned from prior OT malware is going to be useful, at least in the medium term. The third one is OT malware is rare, and it is abusing this type of insecure by design features. So yeah, I mean, we're still going to see it. And unfortunately, there's no way to say just let's fix all the engineering and OT field from a security standpoint, because of course there are reasons why they have been operating in this way. And if you've heard of that debate between IT, OT, and whatnot, there's normally a bit of clash between the needs, right? So we are definitely continue to see this. Next one, threat actors leveraging contractors. This is once again nothing new, and probably we're going to continue observing it. And lastly, OT defenders. Well, this is just what we say. Everything, of course, yeah, everyone should defend. We all know it here. That's why we're here. So I'm probably going to skip that. And yeah, so I just saw the 3-minute sign, so I just want to finish with something super flashy and interesting. I'm really excited because in the next couple of days we're going to be seeing some new developments. There's another conference and another event where they will talk a bit more about that. Unfortunately, I can't bring that right now up, but basically there's another attack that sounds interesting that that will be spoken at this different event. If you're curious, if you like the topic, you're into that, please feel free to come and reach out. I can share a bit more details into what's coming. But yeah, that just was kind of like to leave this spoiler alert and letting you know that everything that was presented in this conference is continuing, and the trend is most likely going to continue. That being said, yeah, that's all on my side. Thanks for everything. If you want to reach out, feel free to. I don't know, I think we have like 1 or 2 minutes. If so, if there's any question or something. Yeah, I don't know if there's any question or something. Otherwise, I don't know. I'll let you continue. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation. それでは質疑応答のお時間。
Yes, we will like to have a Q&A session. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you. Any questions? No questions? The person at the front.
And I'd like to ask you what would the AI implementation will affect on OT threat? What do you think?
Okay, interesting question. I think in the short term, it should not really affect too much. And okay, yeah, actually there is not so much of research in there because at the OT level, they do not implement any of this type of solution that much. If you're thinking more about the attack and development of attacks, the same. I don't think you might even need it because of the type of security you have. The biggest challenge is crossing the line at the external level. Once you are inside the OT network, you probably don't need any of that. Like you are going to run into these protocols, and as long as you know how to communicate within the environment, yeah, this type of AI would not be needed, at least in the short term.
Thank you very much.
よろしいでしょうか。Any other questions? そちらのはい。
Yes, the person at the front.
My question is, I'd like to learn the difference between the TTP of Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war. If you have any found tendency or difference about those two wars, please share about it.
Okay, that is very interesting. So, yeah, actually, I was going to add a slide about Israel-Hamas war. So, glad you're mentioning. So, mainly, what we observed in the Russia side, in Russia/Ukraine, is we are seeing more of this type of complex, sophisticated attack. Given like what I was mentioning, that long history from Russian development of capabilities. In the Israel-Hamas case, we have observed a very different phenomenon. We haven't observed so much of sophisticated attacks, but rather hacktivism. Basically, in both cases, in both events, we have observed it, but in Israel-Hamas, the number of hacktivist cases that happen in a week is just overwhelming, particularly looking at OT. We're finding a ton of actors trying to look for exposed assets, trying to run exploits, some of them known, well, most of them known, and many of those claims, which is also very interesting, are not accurate. It is not only about really doing the attack, but also about communicating that they are doing it and trying to make people feel that they are vulnerable by saying, hey, I'm blowing up your water facilities. Maybe they are not doing it, or most likely they are not, but they want to communicate it to generate more of a psychological impact. So it is very interesting. One of them is a parallel to what's going on in the conflict, and in the other one seems to be more of a psychological type of component.